Good evening, everyone. I'm David Gerald, President of SIAS, and I will be your host for this event, Corporate Governance Roundtable discussion on the topic, the Post Office Scandal, Lessons in Governance, Culture, and Ethics. This program is supported by Institute of Directors of Singapore, Singapore Institute of Directors, SID. Joining us tonight at this roundtable are three distinguished personalities on corporate governance. They are experts. Firstly, Dr. Roger Barker, Director of Policy and Corporate Governance, Institute of Directors. Welcome, Roger, from all the way from UK.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Ms. Joy Tan, she is the Governing Council member at Singapore Institute of Directors, and she represents SID today at this roundtable.
Thank you, David. Wonderful to
Welcome.
be here.
Thank you. And Mr. Lo Wan Chen, who is Vice President at SIAS, and he's also the Chairman at Black Sun Group Asia Pacific. Welcome, Wan Chen. We are here tonight to discuss a very important case that will reveal the lapses in corporate governance that led to the misery of many. In 1999, the post office single shareholder, the UK government, began automating accounting processes at about 14,000 post office branches. This led to introducing of a centralized computer system from supplier Fujitsu, which all branches were connected. This new system replaced the traditional paper-based accounting practices. Unfortunately, serious problems arose, and there was sudden, unexpected increase in the number of sub-postmasters suffering unexplained accounting shortfalls. Instead of investigating the problems and resolving them, the post office management chose to blame the branch operators, prosecuting many of them for financial crimes, with many more made bankrupt and sacked. For almost 2 decades, Post Office Limited, POL, insisted that its electronic point of sale system Horizon was fit for purpose when it was in fact defective. POL pursued hundreds of criminal and civil prosecutions against sub-postmasters on the basis of alleged financial shortfalls identified by Horizon. 2019, the High Court determined that Horizon was riddled with bugs, errors, and defects, and potentially vulnerable to external manipulation by Fujitsu staff who ran the software. So between 1999 and 2015, more than 900 sub-postmasters and others were wrongly prosecuted on charges including false accounting and theft. Several thousand more had their contracts terminated and were ordered to hand over money they had not taken. Many were ostracized by the communities they had served. At least 5 took their own lives. Hundreds died before they could be exonerated or receive compensation. And in fact, the UK Criminal Case Review Commission had called the scandal, I quote, the most widespread miscarriage of justice the CRC has ever seen and represents the biggest single series of wrongful convictions in the British legal history. So at this discussion, we will explore through the panelists corporate governance, uncover how flawed decisions-making and accountability failures contributed to the crisis, organizational culture, examine the toxic environment that allowed these injustices to persist, business ethics, understand the devastating consequences of prioritizing profit over people and integrity. So we are here to hear you, Dr. Roger Barker. So without further delay, can I hand over to you for the presentation?
Well, David, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be able to speak here today about this scandal, which has been causing huge waves huge controversy in the UK, and has, I think, so much to teach us about governance. It involves many different actors, many different aspects of the system not working properly. And the findings that I'm going to present to you today are based on a recently published report, which the Institute of Directors put out a few weeks ago, which is called The Post Office Scandal, A Failure of Governance. And it has particularly benefited from a public inquiry which has been going on, which has been looking in forensic detail at what happened at each stage of this crisis, looking through emails, looking through jotted notes on pieces of paper made by board members or executives or auditors. It really has looked at it in detail. And although we won't have the final report of that public inquiry until next year, I think there's already a huge amount of material on which we can draw conclusions. And especially we as directors or investors or shareholders can draw conclusions, because it tells us, I think, so much about governance. Now, perhaps if we just move to the next slide. Now, yes, I've started my presentation here, both with a picture of the report that we published, but there's also a quote here from a famous novel by Franz Kafka, which somehow encapsulates the experience of sub-postmasters during this scandal. But what I'm going to do, because I know there may be some people in the audience who maybe have followed this debacle from afar, but others may be less familiar with the details. So what I'm going to do is just go through some of the history of this scandal, just so that we have the basic facts in front of us. And if we could move to the next slide. I mean, the post office in one form or another has been around for an awfully long time. I mean, it was established in 1660, believe it or not, by King Charles II. It's been through various forms. Most importantly for our purposes, by the year 2000, Post Office Limited was a subsidiary of the Royal Mail Group, which was the group which delivered all of the UK's postal services. In 2012, there was a big change because Post Office Limited became a standalone entity. The Royal Mail Group, after it separated from Post Office Limited, was privatised and floated on the London Stock Exchange. But Post Office Limited remained a state-owned company because it was very much seen as an entity that was providing a public service, and it wasn't something that it was thought could really survive entirely commercially on its own feet. So it remained an arm's length government-owned body, and the UK government managed its ownership stake through a government agency known as the Shareholder Executive, which later became UK Government Investments in 2016. So if we go to the next slide. So this, there's some figures here, they just give you an idea of how dependent the post office has been through much of its history on government support. It is required by law to operate a minimum number of branches. Those branches are seen as intrinsic parts of local communities across the UK. But this requirement to maintain these branches has always imposed a financial burden on the organisation. And you can see there that from the left-hand graph that even today, a significant subsidy from government is needed to keep the post office afloat. It's tried to become more commercially oriented over the years. It's tried to offer new services, but it still couldn't exist without public support. Now, a key point about post office branches is that most of them are not operated by the post office itself. They're not operated by post office employees. They are actually run by sub-postmasters, who are essentially self-employed business people who hold franchises to run the branches. And they have a contract with the post office. And one of the key aspects of that contract is the requirement that any losses or discrepancies identified in their accounts must be made up by the sub-postmasters out of their own pockets. And if we turn to the next slide, this contractual arrangement had huge implications for many of them from the year 2000 onwards, when, as David said, the new Horizon computerized accounting system was installed in post office branches. And this, of course, started to indicate financial shortfalls. This started to happen very quickly. Not in every case. I mean, that's been one of the tricky aspects of this scandal. Not every sub-postmaster has been subject to these electronic computer-generated glitches, but in a material number of cases, sub-postmasters found that they were experiencing these shortfalls. What the post office did then was to send its investigation teams into post offices and really to respond to these shortfalls in an extremely punitive manner. So rather than consider, well, could there be a problem with our new accounting system here? Could that be causing these problems? It really didn't consider, in most cases, that possibility. The basic assumption that investigators had, and the assumption that the legal teams had, was that sub-postmasters were behaving fraudulently, and that actually this new system had caught them out. They'd been able to get away with it with the paper-based system, but now the new system was catching them out. So what happened here was that the shortfalls were demanded from the sub-postmasters, and if the sub-postmasters couldn't pay, then they were prosecuted with the full force of the law, and often they were prosecuted through private prosecutions rather than the case moving through the criminal prosecution service or via the police. This was a distinctive feature of these prosecutions. And this continued, as you can see, at scale until the year 2015, at which point in time the Post Office decided the public outcry was becoming so great, even though it continued to argue there's nothing wrong with our accounting system, there's nothing wrong with Horizon, we don't accept that. By 2015, they felt that they had to stop this. But of course, by that point, 900 sub-postmasters, or more than 900, had been incorrectly prosecuted. As David said, on charges of false accounting and theft. Several hundred had been sent to prison. And as David said, at least 5 had taken their own lives. Sorry, if we could move to the next slide. In order to do justice to the human suffering that has occurred here, I want to provide you with 3 examples of what happened to sub-postmasters. Now, I could show you many more, but here are at least 3 examples. So this is Noel Thomas. He was accused by the Post Office of stealing £48,000 from his branch. He didn't have the funds to pay for this out of his personal resources. The Post Office investigation team told him that if he pleaded guilty to false accounting, he could avoid the more serious charge of theft. However, when it got to court, he was nonetheless sent to prison for 9 months, and he spent his 60th birthday in jail. We go to the next slide. This is Lee Castleton. He found a shortfall of £25,000 due to Horizon. He refused to accept this. He said he'd done nothing wrong. He was taken to court. He chose to defend himself in court and lost the case. And then the Post Office saddled, or rather the court saddled, Post Office's legal costs of over £300,000 onto Lee, which obviously he couldn't pay, and he was bankrupted. And then if we go on to my 3rd example, this on the next slide, this is Seema Mistra. She was sent to prison in 2011 when she was pregnant. She pleaded guilty, and she was in a desperate state. She pleaded guilty to a charge of false accounting, but was still sent to prison. And she was put on suicide watch in prison. And as in many other cases, Seema Mistra was told by the investigations team and by Post Office that she was the only person that was experiencing these problems with Horizon. You know, this wasn't affecting anyone else. It's just you. And of course, this made her and the other people that were told this all the more desperate, because it suggested that the problem lay with them rather than reflecting any underlying problems with the Horizon IT system. And this was a very common strategy employed by the Post Office investigation department. If we go to the next slide, this kind of divide and rule strategy remains very effective, actually, until the situation occurred that one particularly obstinate and determined former sub-postmaster by the name of Alan Bates, who had his contract with the Post Office cancelled in 2003 because he refused to accept the shortfalls that were being identified by Horizon. He decided to bring affected sub-postmasters together and form the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. And that was in 2009. And this really, I think, was a turning point, because at that point, Alan Bates and the other affected sub-postmasters started to fight back against Post Office, and they gained supporters in the media, amongst members of Parliament. Many members of Parliament were receiving numerous letters from constituents who had been affected by this scandal. And also supporters in the legal profession who decided to help them. And ultimately, they were able to launch a successful legal action against Post Office, which revealed and made absolutely definitively clear the extent of the IT problems with Horizon and the magnitude of the injustice that had been perpetrated by the Post Office against sub-postmasters. And here in the bottom right corner, you can see Alan Bates receiving a knighthood from the Queen in 2024. And there in that top right photo, he's standing next to an actor called Toby Jones, who played Alan Bates in an ITV television drama, which was called Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, which aired on British television at the beginning of this year and was absolutely, I think, instrumental in making this case a real political hot potato for the government. Now, if we go to the next slide, what this slightly complicated diagram reveals, I think, are the dynamics of this campaign to get justice for sub-postmasters, because the campaign took place on many fronts. I talked a bit about Alan Bates and his efforts to bring together sub-postmasters. There was a very influential Computer Weekly article, which was published in 2009, which alerted a lot of people to the problem. There was one particular member of Parliament, James Arbuthnot, who really rallied together a lot of other members of Parliament behind the cause and was very instrumental in taking up the matter with government ministers. And then, of course, there was the group litigation action, which was actually financed by private litigation funders and went to the High Court in 2018. And we'll come on to the findings of that. There were also very prominent journalists. There was one journalist called Nick Wallace, who has written an excellent book on the Post Office scandal, who was very important in championing the cause of sub-postmasters. We go on to the next slide. So yes, I think the watershed moment, the moment of judgment for the Post Office really was the court case, which concluded in 2019 in the High Court in London, under the auspices of Mr. Justice Fraser. And he ruled that there was definitive evidence that the Horizon system was riddled with bugs, errors, and defects. And he gave us this memorable phrase. He said that the unwillingness of the Post Office to even consider this possibility was the 21st century equivalent of maintaining that the earth is flat. He also emphasised that the contract that the Post Office had with sub-postmasters was unfair. So we go to the next slide. This judgment, of course, meant that previous convictions were now clearly unsafe. A massive miscarriage of justice has occurred. And on that basis, the Court of Appeal began to exonerate sub-postmasters. But this was a painfully slow process. And especially after the ITV series went live on British TV at the beginning of this year, the government realised that it had to act. And at that point, it took the extraordinary step of actually enacting legislation to exonerate sub-postmasters at a stroke and to provide them with compensation. That was legally somewhat controversial, but the politics of this were so hot that the government felt it had to do that. We go to the next slide. A public inquiry, public inquiry has been underway since 2021. And you can see here some of the directors who have been grilled by the public inquiry. Tim Parker was chair of the Post Office in the mid to late 2010s. Sir Michael Hodgkinson, a chair of the Post Office in the early 2000s. Alice Perkins, chair of the Post Office at the time of its separation and privatisation. And these two people on the bottom left here, Susanna Story and Robert Callard, were actually shareholder representing directors who sat on the board of Post Office on behalf of the government and who were singularly, I have to say, ill-prepared for their role as directors. We go on to the next slide. And these are been some of the key players in the inquiry. So Wyn Williams, who has been presiding over it, but Jason Beer KC there in bottom right, who has become something of a celebrity in the UK due to the brilliant way in which he's interrogated many of the witnesses and actually uncovered what their real motivations were at particular points in time. We go on to the next slide. This was, I think, a particularly telling moment in the inquiry where actually the former CEO of Royal Mail Group, Dame Moya Green, remember, after 2012, Royal Mail Group was a separate privatised entity, but she was, I think, still very well placed to realise what was going on at the Post Office. She essentially accused the chief executive, Paula Venables of the Post Office, of lying when she was claiming that she knew nothing about the problems with the Horizon system and felt that everything was fine. She basically said, look, I don't believe you. We go on to the next slide. I think a very sort of a succinct summary of what went wrong in the Post Office scandal is provided by Robert Swannell, who also appeared at the inquiry. He was the former chair of UK government and government investments, which was the body which oversaw the Post Office on behalf of the government. And he accepted the fact that when you have an incomplete curiosity and a toxic culture, bad things are likely to happen. And I think this remark encapsulates in a very succinct way what went wrong. The Post Office fundamentally mistrusted sub-postmasters. They thought they were inherently liable to fraud. And therefore, the Post Office was emotionally unable to countenance the possibility that the problem might lie with the IT system. And that it was this toxic culture combined, on the other hand, with a lack of curiosity at board level to understand or challenge these toxic attitudes. And there were many people serving on the board of the Post Office over the years, about 80 people between 2000 and 2020. So these two things together really, I think, were instrumental in giving rise to the scandal. Now, if we go to the next slide, our report goes into detail in terms of the sort of lessons that directors might learn from the scandal. We're going to come on to these at the end of the webinar, but we also make recommendations for policymakers, and there are a number of them there which I think are important. I think it's important to reform the law on computer-generated evidence, because there is a presumption in UK law that if something comes out of a computer, it must be correct, it must be right, and therefore shouldn't necessarily be challenged. But we make a number of other important recommendations for governments to try and make sure that this doesn't happen again. We go on now to my final slide. I want to leave you here with the words of a former senior Australian judge, Neville Owen. And he was making these comments, not about the post office scandal, but about an earlier scandal in Australia. But I think they're incredibly apposite in respect of what happened to the post office, and they were pointed out to me by one of the lawyers that was representing some of the sub-postmasters. You know, this was a case really where people should have known better, especially people on the board. Did they ever really apply common sense? Did they ever apply the smell test when all these sub-postmasters were being prosecuted, when MPs were complaining, when things were being written in the media? Did they ever ask themselves, well, maybe what management are telling us here about the Horizon system might not be correct? Maybe there could be a problem with our IT. And unfortunately, because they didn't do that, it led the post office and it led directors by association to act in essentially quite, well, not quite, but an extremely unethical way. They lost connection with what was right. And that was a real tragedy for all concerned. I think, David, I will finish there and hand back to you.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, I like that. Didn't they ever think what my grandmother would ask? You know, that really tells you that these people who were on the board, who were in the management, did not really think of what really should be asked and what really was behind the whole thing. There was complacency, but we'll come to that. But let me invite Joy Tan and Lo Wen Chen to join us, please, and join the discussion. The single overriding reason why the scandal progressed this far or that far, as did, was clearly complacency in the top echelons of POL, the Post Office London. Everyone assumed that the system was working fine and accepted without question. Management's belief that the culprits must be the sub-postmasters. Nobody questioned the status quo or possessed sufficient professional curiosity to ask the questions. I would like to ask first, Joy, should the need for a director to be curious and therefore challenge existing assumptions be, regulated or written into the corporate governance code? Is it implied? Should it be a second nature for directors?
Thank you very much, David, and obviously really interesting question. Before I start my remarks, I was going to thank Dr. Roger for his extremely clear, succinct and emotional presentation as to what happened in the post office scandal. There's a lot of there was a lot of buzz about the issue, and you've helped us cut through that buzz and move right to the heart of the issues and the findings. So really thank you for that. I should also say that I'm here wearing my Singapore Institute of Directors hat, but equally the views I express, I wouldn't say that the views that I express are on behalf of the SID. These are views that are mine alone. So David, your question was, should there be a need for a director to be curious and challenge existing assumptions, right?
Yes.
And whether there should be some, I guess, prescription of that in our corporate governance code. And I think for the Singapore audience, right? We are talking about the Singapore Code of Corporate Governance that was enacted and has quite recently been reviewed. So I think certainly one of the most important attributes of a director, and certainly a non-executive director, that governance commentators and certainly CRs and SID do constantly reference, right? It's this element of curiosity. This ability and willingness to challenge and probe management's decisions, right? The textbooks, the guidebooks that both SID and CRs promulgate, do say that this sort of objectivity and the fresh perspective that a non-executive director brings to the table is that your most critical element, right? And I think, unfortunately, it does seem that this questioning attribute was missing, or at least insufficient in the post office board, right? So of course, this does beg the question as to whether, some form of hard coding of these requirements are necessary. I suppose I will be the voice of caution and say that, there are difficulties with doing such a sort of hard coding with writing this requirement into the code. The Singapore Corporate Governance Code is like many codes around the world, principles based, right? And the thinking is that if we are overly prescriptive, that would take away a certain amount of flexibility for the listed firms to interpret and apply the code as appropriate to their own circumstances.
Right.
So I will say, obviously there is a need for a director to be curious. It's one of the fundamental attributes of a director. But I do think it might be a bridge too far to require it.
Yeah, so it's a natural instinctive reaction expected of a director, independent director at the board, Wanchan. I mean, really, you don't want to codify this.
Yeah, David, I think to codify it, where does it end? It will become a huge volume of document to govern the directors.
Yes.
But I think the responsibility should also fall on the investors, the shareholders, the members of the public, to question, even in good times, to have a healthy sense of questioning in terms of the roles of the directors. So as much as we would like to have things hard-coded on the directors, which I think we should not, but I think we want it. But at the same time, we should also get the stakeholders to voice out their concerns regularly.
Right. As you know, SIAS sends out questions to 250 listed companies every year in every aspect of governance, performance, strategies, and then investors are guided. So you're saying there could be curiosity which should be naturally arising from the stakeholders. I mean, in England, in UK, definitely. I mean, this is something that is implied, isn't it?
Yes, but I think I'm somewhat skeptical, though, about the solution to this lying in just adding something to the Corporate Governance Code, or in fact, a legal or regulatory response that will solve this problem. I mean, we do make suggestions to governments, but one thing we're not suggesting is that there should be some kind of stringent regulatory response, because ultimately the thing that will prevent this happening in the future is having directors who understand what they're there to do, that understand intrinsically that their job is to question and is to think about the interests of stakeholders, including shareholders and other stakeholders, and get to the bottom of what is actually going on in organizations. Because I think this was a point that was made by the UK government, which in this case was the shareholder. The UK government said, I think with some justification, look, we are too distant from what is going on in the company. We were being told everything was fine, so we accepted that. If the directors, who are the people that are supposed to be representing us within a company and looking after our interests, if they are having the wool pulled over their eyes, what chance do we have? So the solution has to be that we have better directors who are well-trained, who understand their duties and ask the right questions and see that that's within their DNA.
Yeah, so a curious nature should be obvious and is needed to overcome complacency. But in this case, very obviously, overcoming a toxic culture was necessary. right? And clearly the post office's culture was, the culture at the post office, London, was toxic, which in turn bred mistrust of the sub-postmasters and contributed significantly to the scandal. So we have been criticized. Our latest Singapore Code has been criticized for having a lack of sufficient focus on corporate culture, right? Critics argue that the code could do more to emphasize the alignment of corporate culture with the organization's purpose and values. Whilst the code mentions the need for a desired, in inverted commas, in desired organizational culture, it lacks specific provisions to ensure this alignment. Is it needed, or would it still be, same position as Joy took that, and all of you have taken, not to, build layers and layers onto the code. Now, the question is this for the panel: should more be done to codify greater specifics into the code with regard to having the right corporate culture that would encourage ethical behavior and value creation? Let me start with Joy.
Yes, David. So you've foreshadowed what my response was gonna be, right?
Right,
I mean, I think certainly how to ensure the right culture and conduct, is an area of focus for regulators and commentators and stakeholders all around the world, right? And of course, rightly so, because I think as Dr. Roger has been discussing also, the corporate failings in this case, and indeed many corporate failings, right, can be attributed to a failing of corporate culture, an appropriate lack of appropriate tone from the top, and so on, right? But I do feel that being overly prescriptive regarding desired organizational culture, might not be the right answer, particularly given our principles-based approach, in which does give listed companies flexibility in sort of shaping what the individual cultures would be. I mean, I will say, of course, the SID does have our own code of conduct for directors, but this is obviously voluntary. It's not prescriptive. That said, of course, we would really like to see a move towards a wide-scale adoption of some kind of code. But I do think it is a bridge too far to mandate it in our corporate governance code at this moment.
What's the mood in UK, Roger?
Yes, well, we have also just launched our code of conduct for directors. So I think the UK and Singapore is pretty on the same page here. As a voluntary benchmark for directors, something that directors can refer to, and potentially, if you're observing bad culture or bad behavior, it's something that you can wave in front of people and say, do you really think you should be doing this? But I think, the corporate governance code is a kind of quasi-regulatory mechanism, which is about the sort of structure, mainly about the structure and activities of directors, and you comply or explain against it in annual reports. And that, when you're talking about culture, I think maybe that could be better mentioned in guidance, which sits underneath a corporate governance code. That's probably a better place for it than the corporate governance code. But ultimately, I think getting to grips with culture, it's about directors, I think, breaking out of the boardroom bubble and actually engaging with the organization and speaking to stakeholders. And because that didn't happen during the post office scandal. No board member ever spoke to a sub-postmaster. No board member, apart from perhaps the chair, spoke to members of parliament. So they were living in this bubble where they were just being fed information and views from management, and they were accepting them.
Or were they overprotective of the reputation that might ensue should they be involved in something that they thought should be put squarely and fairly on the technology? And here I would like to ask Wanchen, the challenge posed by tech advances in AI. Obviously, the UK IOD found that most POL directors were ill-equipped to provide proper oversight of major IT projects or legal risks. There was also the suggestion that they suffered from groupthink. Right? This was in IOD's paper.
Yep.
Singapore Court states that the board is a group, inverted commas, as a group should provide the appropriate balanced mix of skills, knowledge, and experience, and other aspects of diversity such as gender and age so as to avoid groupthink and foster constructive debate. However, the local code does not directly address emerging issues such as digitalization, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. So, Wenchen, going forward, you should agree, I think, navigating the AI transition and managing cybersecurity threats will become ever more important issue for directors. Although I would invite you first, but I would ask Roger and Joy to join in. Should the code explicitly require that some directors or all directors be IT savvy or IT literate so as to mitigate risks posed by the rise of AI and other terms of technology? The very culprit in this Office of London debacle.
What,
Yeah.
do you want me to
Yes,
start? I mean,
yes, all right. Yes.
no, I agree, David. I think I don't think that every director needs to be an IT expert, but they need to have IT literacy. And I think we're currently revising our competency framework for directors, and the competency framework sets out what the key aspects of competence that any director needs to have if they're going to serve on the board in the 2020s. Historically, it's been areas like corporate governance, finance, strategy, leadership. But I think we need to add to that now tech literacy, because almost every business of any kind is going to be utilizing technology. And if our respective economies are going to be leaders in the years ahead, we're going to have to adopt AI on a massive scale across our economies. And the directors of the companies doing that, need to understand what's inside the AI black box. So I think that's very important.
Would you be bold enough to require from SIDs or make a recommendation that in UK, directors, at least one or two, should have technology and knowledge, good tech knowledge?
Yes, well, what we do recommend in this report is that all directors of government-owned entities should actually have a chief technology officer at board level. And that's something that private sector companies may well wish to consider. It will depend on the specific circumstances, but it's certainly well worthy of consideration.
But everything was hidden from the directors here in this case, POL. The management hid it, Horizon hid it. How could they go and unearth it?
Well, I think there were a lot of red flags. I mean, that I suppose is the issue, that for a period of time, you perhaps could say, well, it was being kept from them because management was not open. But after a period of time, all sorts of red flags started to emerge. I've mentioned some of them appearing in the public arena. There were lots of other internal reports. There was a report undertaken by a firm of forensic accountants called Second Sight, which alerted the board to the problem. So I think one of the big lessons for me from this scandal is when you see red flags, don't just get talked out of them by management. You need to actually dig deeper.
Yes. Anything to add briefly, Wanchen, or do you agree?
Definitely. And also, I think the measure of good as well as good, I think we have to really look at it seriously. Just like we say, disclose culture, but should we disclose both good and bad culture? I mean, where do you draw the line? So I think the measure of things which are very subjective, we need to relook at it constantly.
Right. And the view from Joy.
Just very quickly from me
Yes.
in terms of sort of IT savviness, I agree with Roger. I think IT literacy is becoming so critical that there should be a certain, at least a certain degree of IT literacy that every director should have, right?
Yes.
And I do also sort of second the call to have at least one director that is, that has deep IT competency. I mean, I think to your David, your question to Roger, this. The management and clearly the IT department in this particular instance were telling the directors, don't worry, everything is all is well, right? And how could they have looked beyond that? Well, if they had someone on the board with that deep IT competency, they would have been able to ask the right questions of management and the IT department, and probably not be put off by the surface level sort of responses that had been given, but were, that they had the skills to look under the hood, right? Because they did not have that, that unfortunately did hamstring them in being able to take things further, right? And who knows? It may be question to Roger. Did they appreciate what the forensic accounting report was actually telling them?
Yes.
Right.
I think one of the interesting things about this scandal, it probably was in two phases. So the first phase, I think that management and board were ignorant of the problems in Horizon. They weren't curious about them, but they just took the word of Fujitsu that everything was fine.
Right.
But then beyond a certain point, it moved to cover up. And I think what we explore in this report is that a crucial moment was when the Royal Mail was privatised and listed on the London Stock Exchange, because they stated in the prospectus that there were no risks arising from the Horizon IT system. And at that point, they'd kind of, dug their grave, as it were, because I think and then afterwards they were just doubling down on that. Even though the evidence was emerging, they felt, well, we've in a very crucial, important document, we have made this incorrect statement. We're just going to try and avoid any consequences of that to the bitter end.
In
and
fact,
then eventually, of course, the courts told them to stop.
Yeah, one of the delegates today is asking exactly shouldn't such discrepancies being flagged out by the auditors? Because the financial auditors, they went through the records. Didn't they flag this out?
Yes, I think there are big...
with us. Yes, we have a former auditor here with us, Wanchen. Wanchen, can you hear me?
Yep, I can, David. Go ahead.
So the auditors shouldn't such discrepancies be flagged out by the auditors?
Well, if it's, if it's related to the financials and they've done the work, then it should. But with hindsight, David, they can look at a lot of things and people to pin the blame on. And with just bringing up the topic of AI once again,
yes,
things are going to be moving faster and faster. So I think the role of the not just auditors but the CFO, the internal auditors, things going to be more real time rather than looking at things which are way in the past.
Well, as we go along, more and more will now be cast on the performance of directors. Assessing board performance is the next area I'd like to visit. The UK Corporate Governance Code recommends that boards conduct an internal review. I think our code too has that, every year bolstered with an external review done by an independent body. But I don't think we have a requirement for external review. And very few, or a handful do that every 3 years. However, the only board review of POL was an internal one from 2013, which was undertaken by Alice Perkins, the former chair. One panelist said the 2013 review was ineffectual. There is little evidence of rigor in terms of process. There's an annoying tale of directors marking their own homework. In Singapore parlance, it's own self checking own self. So that is one reason why independent external reviews were introduced in the first place and became part of the code. In fact, the Singapore Corporate Governance Code states the board undertakes a formal annual assessment of its effectiveness as a whole and that of each of its board committees and individual directors. However, there is no requirement for an external party to be involved. Is it time for us to stipulate for external review? Joy.
You know, when I think then serving chair of the SID was heard on publicly on this topic before COVID, the view he expressed was no, own self check own self is still sort of not unfit for purpose, right? I mean, I guess I will say this, you know, obviously. Third-party board assessment is phenomenally useful. It challenges chairmen and boards to sort of think outside their comfort zone and to coin Roger's term, the boardroom bubble, right? So we do certainly feel that it's tremendously helpful, and I will say that we are actually seeing more external reviews engaged in. I think particularly for areas where there could be more self-interest, like directors' remuneration. And I think that in sort of those sorts of contexts, boards are reaching out to more third-party benchmarking. And periodic assessments, and of course this is I feel the right direction of travel for listcos in Singapore.
Right. I mean, SID membership. That's this thing about in UK has said the UK IOD wants the government to require directors of all publicly owned entities to sign up to the IOD's code of conduct for directors, right? Your code of conduct still remains not mandatory, but if you want to be a director, as a shareholder body, SIS desires very much that directors should be all compulsorily required to be members of SID and subscribe on the basis that they subscribe to the code of conduct. That would give assurance to shareholders of listed companies. They put a lot of money into companies, and then you find directors, there's no strings attached. You sit on the board, yes, you have to comply with the regulatory requirements, but what about the code of conduct for directors to be made mandatory? Roger, you want for public owned entity. I say to all companies, listed companies,
Yes, well, we would like to see the directors of all and the boards of all organizations, all companies, not just listed, commit to the code of conduct. We aren't advocating that it's a compulsory part of the regulatory apparatus, because we are very aware of the fact that directors find the regulatory burden to be already pretty huge, and we don't want to place new legal requirements onto them. But what we say to directors is, if you want to demonstrate your commitment to good governance, good behavior, and that you welcome this as a benchmark against which potentially other stakeholders could hold you accountable, commit to the code and do so publicly.
There is another query from one of the delegates here. Post office services are purely public centric. Where was the whistleblowing mechanism in that incident?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question?
Public office services, post office services are purely public centric. Where was the whistleblowing mechanism?
That is a very good point. And in fact, one of our recommendations is that the law needs to be strengthened, because the law in the UK at the moment does not protect so-called contractors or third-party business partners within the whistleblowing framework, so that they're not protected. It only protects employees of an organisation. So, of course, the sub-postmasters, as I mentioned, were not employees of the post office. They were franchise holders. They were independent business people. So they weren't part of our whistleblowing protection. So we are advocating for improvements, modernisation of whistleblowing law.
Yes. And shouldn't the first timers on the board, the directors coming on the board, be required to be, I think this is something which we raised before. They have no experience. They're serving first time, taking care of the interests of all shareholders and stakeholders. Shouldn't they be accredited by the UK, IOD and Singapore SID? I've said this publicly.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, what I thought was a really telling in the post office scandal, there were several people who joined the board of post office who were appointed as UK shareholder representatives. They were civil servants, they were working for this body, UKGI, and they were asked to sit on the board of post office. And several of them had no experience of serving as a director. They had not been trained as a director. Suddenly, from one day to the next, they were there on the board.
And they make very important. They make very important decisions.
They absolutely did.
Of the company.
Totally, they were there, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't challenge management. They didn't feel it was their job to challenge management.
Yes, they were looking at the bank account, Roger.
Yes.
If the nature of the business is not franchised model, would there have been any difference? Do you think the CEO or the employees, will they be prosecuted in that case if it was not a franchised business? If it was under the UK government only and not sub-postmasters, but postmasters were civil servants?
Yes, I think there were some unique features of this case, and which explain why people were sent to prison and the really severe legal response, which perhaps you wouldn't see at other organisations. As the audience member rightly says, these were franchisees. The post office had a historical power to directly prosecute people rather than go through the police or the Crown Prosecution Service, which was an unusual feature of the post office as an organisation. It had inherited this power. This sort of scandal wouldn't happen in the same way at other organisations, but I think at board level, it still is something. It's the board behaved in a way which I think you probably see at many other organisations.
Absolutely right. Folks being coming on board without adequate training, first-time directors, no proper induction. I mean, those things happen, across many boards, don't they?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, they always cry that there aren't enough people to serve on the board, but it's in our parlance, it is a kakinang, I mean, well, buddy system, Roger. But let me ask this question, that does the post office scandal suggest that the role of non-executive director is not working as it should have? How can we make NEDs more effective? It's only through, training and getting them accredited. And what else?
Yeah, I think for me, this is a big question which comes out of this and a number of other scandals. And because one of the biggest changes in corporate governance that we've observed over the last 20 to 30 years is that boards have been almost entirely taken over by non-executives. 30 years ago, most boards consisted of executive directors who were running various functional departments. We shifted to non-exec, and we did that for good reason, because we thought they would be more independent, have a bit of distance, and could therefore be more objective. But they're up against big obstacles. They're part-timers. They're very dependent on management. If they're just turning up for board meetings, they're seeing a partial view of the company. And we need to think: is this system working? I'm not suggesting that it should be abandoned as an approach, but we certainly need to think how we can make it work better.
Yes.
Yeah. I would agree with that, right? How do we better support them training, induction, etc., accreditation. Thanks for that shout out, David. We would love there to be accreditation as well.
Yes, but keep asking for it. Sometimes manna from heaven doesn't fall just like that. You got to keep praying and asking for it. Okay, you do that. Finally, may I ask Roger, what are the key lessons that we can take away from this scandal? Can you summarize it for us? We got just 5 minutes or 7 minutes left.
I can. I wonder, would it be possible to put up the final slides from the presentation? Because that, I think, is what we do in this report. We bring together what we think are some key lessons for directors from the entire scandal, and here they are, just summarised. Face up to uncomfortable truths. This was a factor in the post office scandal. To accept that there had been wrongful prosecutions was a very unpalatable thing to accept. It would lead to huge compensation claims, huge embarrassment. But ultimately, if you don't face up to things, they just get worse. Right. I've spoken a bit about break out of the boardroom bubble and don't ignore red flags. Outsourcing, that relationship with that outsourcing relationship with Fujitsu was just mismanaged. Fujitsu effectively captured the post office. The post office thought they couldn't get rid of Fujitsu because they were so dependent on them. So that is important. I think we haven't really touched on the role of legal advisors in this whole scandal. And one of the things which came up was directors were very blindly following the advice of lawyers. So when lawyers said, you've got to fight the sub-postmasters legal action, fight them to the end, that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. It may have been legally possible, but from a moral point of view and from a business point of view, it wasn't necessarily the right thing. So ultimately, the buck rests with directors. And I think, just the final point, really, maintain a moral compass. That has to underpin everything that we do as a directors. And that's why codes of conduct are so important.
Right. So before I close, can I ask Joy, have anything to say before, in conclusion?
No, I think actually this slide is probably the most critical slide, and we've taken it away. The lessons learned that resonate across the world, and that will be shaping corporate governance approaches to come.
Thank you, Wan Chen.
We got to make sure that we don't get the situation where we can't see the wood for the trees. As you pile on more regulations, more codes, more code of conduct, I think we might lose the plot. So I will encourage directors to walk the straight and narrow at all times.
Right. So thank you all for attending this roundtable. We've had a variety of views. Excellent views from the panelists, especially Dr. Roger Barker from UK, Joy from SID, Joy Tan from SID, and Wan Chen from Black Sun and SIS. Please complete the feedback form, which will pop up on your browser as you exit the webinar. Thank you, Roger, Joy, and Wan Chen. It has been a very interesting discussion, and thank you for the very detailed exposition of all the issues in this POL saga. I hope it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen here. We have had other sagas here, but a lot of things to do. And if you want to be a director, you have to be trained, you have to be knowledgeable, and you have to take the responsibility. Thank you very much, and good night.